studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, January 27th, 2015. As Egyptians commemorate the fourth anniversary of the Tahrir Square protests, we'll turn to Middle East expert and journalist Thanassis Cambanis to discuss his new book, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story. And we'll hear from Mumia Abu Jamal on the latest in Yemen, as its revolutionary legacy is also hanging in the balance. Then here in the U.S., the Supreme Court has decided to take up the Fair Housing Act of 1968. My guest, Dr. John A. Powell, will explain what's at stake. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, rebels claiming allegiance to the Islamic State group attacked Libya's most luxurious hotel earlier today. The Corinthia Hotel in the capital Tripoli attracts foreign diplomats and tourists. 5 people were killed as the standoff came to a close. The attack came in the midst of ongoing battles between two factions vying for political power in Libya, more than 3 years after a US-Nato operation ousted a longtime dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Meanwhile, ISIS forces in the Kurdish border town of Kobani in Syria have apparently been driven out after many months of battles. Kurdish Peshmerga forces backed by U.S. air power have declared victory, saying they now control 90% of Kobani's territory. Well, Bob, these are two very different stories, but is there a lesson here on the role of the U.S. military, which plunged Libya into chaos, but seems to have played a more positive role in Kobani?
I wouldn't draw too many direct lessons from these two cases. I think the larger lesson, which we need to remind ourselves of over and over again, is to think of the Middle East, North Africa, that area, what we sometimes call the Muslim world, as a political ecosystem, and recognize that as in a real ecosystem, one change affects other places. You can't make solutions work, sort of generically. So I think we should start talking about, things like a regional peace conference. The United States, I think, has to openly acknowledge its failures of the past, which it's never done. There are some things that are hard to imagine being done politically in the United States, but which would really change the conditions on the ground and make a more holistic approach possible. So any success militarily that beats back forces that are truly a threat is to be, admired in some sense, but it's not the long-term solution.
Right. A federal jury in Virginia yesterday found former CIA official Jeffrey Sterling guilty of 9 charges relating to the Espionage Act. The case revolved around the leaked details of an ill-conceived CIA operation called Project Merlin to plant flawed nuclear plans in the hands of Iranian authorities. Mr. Sterling, who is African-American, was relieved of duty after he alleged racial discrimination, so prosecutors claimed he was a disgruntled former employee who leaked details of the plan as revenge. The New York Times' James Risen had been pressured for years to testify against Sterling based on the assumption that he was Risen's source. After much public pressure, the Justice Department decided against forcing Risen's testimony. According to the Times, the DOJ court had no direct proof that Mr. Sterling, who managed the Iranian operation, provided the information to Mr. Risen, but prosecutors stitched together a strong circumstantial case, end of quote. Observers called the guilty verdict, quote, a new low in the war in whistleblowers and government hypocrisy. Well, Bob, how do you respond to this verdict?
Well, I can't comment on this because of national security concerns. Okay, there are 2 things that are really depressing about this case. One is, I wasn't in the courtroom, but if you read the accounts, we're calling this a circumstantial case, but it's a really circumstantial case. It's a really weak case. And the fact that a jury convicted reminds us that when the government says national security, they often can prevail. The other depressing aspect of this, of course, is that the Obama administration, many of us didn't have high expectations of Obama, but we thought at least on some of these more egregious things, he would roll back the worst of previous presidential positions on this. And in this case, of course, it's the opposite. It's a reminder when it comes to this kind of use of executive authority to cover up the failures of the intelligence community, the Defense Department, whatever it might be, that this administration is no different, and as someone pointed out, even worse than some previous ones.
And finally, despite having a majority in both houses of Congress, the Republican Party has failed in its attempt to pass a veto-proof bill approving the Keystone XL pipeline project. After the House swiftly passed such a bill, the Senate yesterday was only able to muster 53 votes, 8 shy of a supermajority. Senate Democrats had denounced Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's move to cut off debate on the bill before the vote. President Obama has vowed to veto the measure after years of public pressure against the pipeline by environmental activists who see it as a major threat to global warming. The vote comes as a record-breaking blizzard hits New York City, Boston, and other East Coast areas. Such extreme weather is, of course, consistent with scientific predictions of climate change. So, Bob, is Keystone dead? Can climate justice activists claim victory on this one issue?
Well, if it's a victory, it's a very small one. I think there's a debate within the environmental community about whether the opposition to the pipeline is merely symbolic or will really have a material effect on how much of that tar sand oil gets pumped. But I think it's wrong to overestimate the importance of this. The Obama administration has not been strong on this question in the first place. It's all of the above so-called strategy of encouraging the exploitation of more fossil fuels is not a hopeful sign. And I think in the end, this is really more of a symbolic question than anything. The price of oil is going to have a lot of effect on this. Not much reason to be cheering at this point.
Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. Nearly 24 protesters were killed and about 100 injured on Sunday during commemorations of Egypt's 2011 revolution that toppled longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak. A number of Egyptians were also arrested in what observers are criticizing is an arbitrary manner during the 4th anniversary events. Human Rights Watch issued a statement demanding that the state investigate abuses during the demonstrations. Yesterday, hundreds more rallied for the funerals of those killed over the weekend, the same day as 2 of Mr. Mubarak's sons were released from prison. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who has banned all public protests, appeared among world leaders in Davos, Switzerland last week, where he received a warm welcome. The Financial Times called it, quote, the embrace of an Arab strongman who offers short-term stability and the repression of militant Islamism. Observers of Egypt's inspiring democratic revolution 4 years ago mourn what appears for all intents to have come full circle with a new dictator heading up the old repression. But is it just too soon to tell? Joining me now to discuss the revolution is Thanassis Cambanis. He is a contributor to the New York Times, Boston Globe, and other publications. He's also a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City. He also lives in Beirut, Lebanon. His latest book is called Once Upon a Revolution, an Egyptian Story. Welcome to Uprising, Thanassis.
To be with you.
So before we get to the book and the story of the revolution, let's talk about some of the latest news in Egypt that puts the revolution, I think, a little bit into perspective, even if it's short-term perspective. Among the protesters killed over the weekend was Shaima al-Sabag, an activist with the Socialist Popular Alliance Party. She was a 32-year-old mother who was chanting at a rally, and police used birdshot, which is supposed to be non-lethal. They shot her in the head and other parts of her body, and she died in the hospital hours later, and her story has been all over social media. She's seen as sort of symbolic of the martyrs of this new wave of the revolution. Is she representative of the scores of Egyptians who are seemingly slowly picked off these days by the government?
Well, the very fact that she was protesting tells us a story about the enduring anger at the existing regime. So she comes from a party that its name notwithstanding, was somewhat supportive of the dictatorship that brought Sisi to power a year and a half ago. So she's a leftist. She's a sort of traditional, secular, maybe middle-class Egyptian, and she represents a demographic that is supposed to be happy with the restoration of the old order, and which is supposed to be so angry at what the Islamists did in power that they're willing to accept anything in the name of stability and defending secularism. So the fact that she was out there tells us that the regime is already failing quite early in its new chapter in power to persuade one of its key demographics. It also tells us that this regime has raised the level of repression and violence to levels that even Hosni Mubarak would have considered unthinkable. In the last year and a half, there have been a lot of Islamists killed protesting in Egypt, and that is politically feasible because so much of the public opinion has been turned against the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood. They're equated with terrorists, and the sort of mass hysteria the government has fanned up has stuck. But someone like Shaima is the kind of Egyptian citizen that even the government presents itself as being on the side of. So this is the kind of violence, state violence and state murder that's very inconvenient for the regime. This is not the kind of person they're supposedly supposed to kill, and it's going to cause them a lot of difficulties. And I think what it does is it reveals just how intolerant and how brutal this new order is, and the sort of unprecedented level of violence on which it depends.
And the Interior Ministry has promised an investigation into al-Sabah's death. Now, Juan Cole blogged that it was quite ironic that the Egyptian government attempted to cancel the commemoration of the January 25th revolution on the grounds that that Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah had died and needed to be mourned. And of course, Saudi Arabia did play quite a significant role in the revolution, not a positive one, and in many Arab Spring revolutions.
Right. Saudi Arabia has bankrolled a lot of the most repressive and regressive regimes in Egypt that played a very hands-on role. There was a Muslim Brother elected president, the first ever civilian president in Egypt. Under his rule, the Muslim Brotherhood behaved quite atrociously and anti-democratically. It was part of an elected process and a transition, but it was a very ugly one. And Saudi Arabia worked with the Egyptian military to come up with what it saw as a solution, which was a military coup that would shut the Brotherhood down once and for all, and effectively shut down Egypt's democratic transition once and for all. Since that time, Saudi Arabia and its like-minded oil states, Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, have spent billions of dollars in Egypt, somewhere between 12 and 20, propping up the restored military rule. And that is just one part of a regional strategy in which Saudi Arabia has bankrolled, on the one hand, certain schools of religious extremism, and on the other hand, has been the financial guarantor of repressive authoritarian regimes.
Now, Thanassis, a number of people were arrested over the weekend as well, just adding to the huge prison population in Egypt. And Egypt's prisons are bursting at the seams. Many of them, of course, Muslim Brotherhood supporters. They've arrested hundreds, thousands of them. But they've also arrested revolutionaries like Ahmed Maher of the April 6th Youth Group, blogger Ala Abdel Fattah. Meanwhile, Mubarak's two sons were just released from prison yesterday. Mubarak himself has been acquitted, although remains sort of in a military hospital. It's not clear if he's really free. That irony is also quite indicative of where this revolution has come, isn't it?
Right. I mean, we can't. If you are someone who would like to see a democratic or accountable or more just or more free Egypt, it's impossible not to find these developments depressing. That said, there are some really key differences, and we have to look at all this from a historical vantage point. We're at the beginning of a process of generational change. It began in the Arab world, arguably in 2010 and 2011 with the Uprising, maybe even earlier than that. And it's going to take at least one generation, if not two, to see how it plays out. The big differences. So you described this sort of tragic reversal, right, where all the idealists from Tahrir Square are in prison or exile or dead, and meanwhile the old dictator and his sons who engaged in countless criminal acts are released. That is one sad prism through which to look at it. Now, the other prism is, if you look at what's happening, there are two developments that show that we're on a different historical trajectory. The first is the regime. The regime is having to use unprecedented levels of force and violence to keep the lid on the cauldron of Egypt. Sisi, in a year and a half, has arrested something like 50,000 people for simple political crimes like protesting without a permit. Hosni Mubarak never had to lock that many people up or kill that many people in order to keep his regime stable. The second thing, and which is frankly I think more interesting and important, is the ongoing acts of political dissent and speech that are occurring not just in exile but inside Egypt. So 4 years into this sort of failed or stalled transition process, at a time when you get shot in the face and killed for holding flowers in downtown Cairo, you would think there wouldn't be that many people left who are willing to go out in the streets and challenge the regime. And yet, on the contrary, we find secular people, Islamists, right-wingers, left-wingers, nationalists, communists, and everything in between willing to engage in quite dangerous acts of dissent and defiance. They're publishing manifestos, they're writing in newspapers, they're trying to go on TV, although TV won't have them, they're marching, and they're trying to come up with alternate political ideas. So they're fighting and they're thinking. That tells me, now I don't know where that leads ultimately. It might lead to some political ideas that I personally am not fond of, but it's certainly leading Egypt and the Arab world out of the 60-year impasse in which people were told that their only choices were military dictators or Islamic fundamentalists.
So, Thanassis, in your book, you called Once Upon a Revolution, you profiled two men through whose eyes to tell the story of what happened 4 years ago. Very different backgrounds and different approaches, in a way, to the revolution. Bassem Kamel is one of the men. He was a part of Egypt's middle class who could have kept his head down and just minded his own business. He, it's at some level didn't thrive under Mubarak, but was able to have an existence, but he chose to become active in the fight to overthrow Mubarak. How representative was he of ordinary Egyptians who, even if they could have continued to live their lives, chose to speak out because they wanted a different future for their kids?
Bassem, I think, is one of the most important characters I met. I followed dozens of activists over 4 years, and I ended up focusing on the two who I thought were sort of told the most representative and one of the most important slices of the story. Bassem, at age 40, with 3 kids, with a family business at stake, a lot more, frankly, at stake than most of the revolutionaries have, reached a breaking point and decided to become a political activist and risk all of it, not because he came from a dynastic family of activists. To the contrary, he came from a family that intensely discouraged politics because of the risk. But he no longer felt he had a choice because life had become so dead-end and so humiliating. That is a journey that millions of Egyptians traveled, and which, frankly and sadly, they're still traveling today. It's ultimately the unbearable nature of twin grievances, where you can't live and have a livelihood and all those things that make daily life manageable, schools for your kids, health care, a house. You don't have those things, and on top of it, you're also routinely humiliated by a state which will ignore your needs when you're attacked by a mugger, which will lock you up randomly and capriciously and torture you even if you committed no crime. And so this is what became too much for Egyptian people to bear, and this is what became too much for Bassem Kamel to bear as a man entering semi-comfortable middle age, and drove him into a career of politics.
The other man that you profile is a younger man named Muaz Abdul Karim, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I appreciate that you profiled him, given that the Muslim Brotherhood is part of the story, and regardless of what the leadership represents, there are certainly a big chunk of the Egyptian population who rally behind the Muslim Brotherhood. Tell us about Muaz.
Well, Muaz is a particularly interesting character because He was someone who came out of a dynasty of political activism within the Brotherhood, grew up in this secretive, faith-based organization, and learned a lot of skills there. A lot of skills about how to be a clandestine organizer, how to mobilize people, spread information under the nose of police. But he also came out of his youth in the Muslim Brotherhood with decidedly un-Brotherhood ideas. He believed in the secular state. He believed his deep religious faith left him somehow committed to a pluralistic political order in which religion was private and not public. And these ideas, along with his sort of funny, rebellious character, put him at great odds with the authoritarians who led the Muslim Brotherhood. Within a few months of Tahrir Square, he was clashing directly with leaders of the Brotherhood. He was publicly opposing their moves to move directly into politics. And eventually, for his free thinking, he was expelled from the Brotherhood. Now, today, he's in this very strange limbo. He's mistrusted and disliked by his former comrades in the Brotherhood, at least some of them, because he dared to defy the organization's orders. And yet, a lot of his secular friends and comrades from the revolutionary movement also have come to mistrust him because they are so angry at the Muslim Brotherhood. And the refrain I hear a lot, including actually from Bassem, who used to be friends with Muaz, he says, I can't trust this guy because he used to be a brother, and once a brother, always a brother. And that is, in a way, the impasse of the revolution itself, until religious Egyptians and secular Egyptians can find a common core agenda that goes around the ideas of rights and citizenship and building a real rule of law. They're going to be easily defeated by divide and conquer tactics.
So, Thanassis, a lot of what you write in your book emphasizes this idea of the fact that in Egypt, the two most organized parts of society have been, of course, the regime, the military, and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is perhaps why many of the secular forces, the leftists, the students, the young folks who may or may not have even chosen an ideology, did not really have a chance to organize and even express and clarify what their demands were, whether they wanted leaders or not. And in some ways, that was even part of the problem. And you also talk about the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, which I think was the only political organization that really emerged as a new organization from the revolution. Tell us about this coalition.
Well, this was the one umbrella group that included representatives of all the different ideologies. So you had these small youth movements that boldly and creatively made those protests happen in January 2011, and they included Islamists, they included communists, socialists, Arab nationalists, some pretty right-wing folks, some left-wing folks, and some very fundamentalist folks. Now, they, during that brief period at the beginning, recognized that there were many, many things they all could agree on, and they could exhaust many, many years of struggle fighting for those things, like ending police torture, let's say, or having fair elections. And if and when they achieved those things, then they could go their separate ways and fight over secondary questions of political power and organizing a government. So they came together, they made this committee called the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, and it was very idealistic in its conceit. It operated by consensus. Each organization had one position, and in the early days, it was a fantastic clearinghouse for ideas, and it also lent a fair amount of leverage and influence to the revolutionary youth. If the Revolutionary Youth Coalition put out a statement that said these are the revolution's demands, people listened. In short order, however, within even 6 months, that institution became riven by two key issues that bedeviled the revolution. One was the mistrust between the Islamists and the secular activists. The other was this sort of cultish, reflexive rejection of politics and leadership. And this is something that actually continues to be a problem today. This is an idea that the authoritarian regimes very successfully built, which is, if you're seeking political power, you're selfish. You're not really putting the nation first. And a lot of the activists internalized this fake idea, and they would say, when confronted with some kind of conflict with the military, they'd say, well, far be it from us to seek power. We're not seeking power. We're not playing politics. Well, as soon as you abjure the fundamental process of demanding your rights through politics, you've essentially been checkmated by the authoritarians who are trying to keep you from getting your rights. Today, there's still a huge stigma attached to pursuing change through politics. Bassem Kamal is running for parliament actually this spring, and a lot of his old comrades call him a sellout simply because he wants to try and change things from within the system.
And of course, these are very similar to the issues that plague political movements everywhere, including here in the United States. One can think of so many movements, one of the latest being the Occupy Wall Street movement. In your book, you put Egypt's revolution into a historical perspective by comparing it to the French Revolution and how it took 80 years and 3 tries for France to get to where it is today. In that sense, should we be a lot more hopeful about Egypt and try to take the long view?
That's how I try to look at it, partly out of affection. I want these idealistic ideas to succeed, but setting aside my sort of emotional response, I think from a historical perspective, we see a process begun, much like we saw that in the United States with the Revolution and the Federalist Papers and the long process that led eventually to the abolishment of slavery and the implementation of real rule of law over centuries, and in France as well. In Egypt, as the heart of the Arab world, we see for the first time in 3 generations since the 50s new political ideas being created by Egyptians themselves, not foreign imports. And these ideas are being created in the crucible of great risk and great violence. And we know that big political ideas, whether we're talking about Marxism and communism or capitalism or the liberal consensus, take decades, if not longer, to emerge. So, as I said earlier, I can't be 100% optimistic that what comes of this is going to be something beautiful and appealing and guaranteed to work, but I am quite sure that what's going to come of it is a new body of political ideas that's going to be a new organizing pole for the Arab world.
You mentioned Bassem Kamal is running for parliament. What about Muaz Abdul Karim, the other man that you profiled? Where is he at today?
He is rattling around in exile. He's based in Istanbul, and he's still somewhat idealistically and futilely trying to convince his Islamist and secular brothers and sisters in the revolutionary movement to put aside their differences and forge a common agenda. He hasn't had much luck with that, but he still seems to think it's only a matter of time before everyone bridges their differences and comes up with a unified revolutionary front.
Finally, Thanassis, do you think Egyptians will have to give al-Sisi the Mubarak treatment in order to move forward from this part of the long view of the revolutionary struggle? Do you think Sisi's days are possibly numbered, or is the military simply too strong in Egypt?
I think all the core grievances that led to 2011 are still in place. And so unfortunately for Egyptians, there's guaranteed to be another breaking point. And one of the differences they'll face in Sisi is a man who's willing to use a lot more force than Mubarak was. So I fear the next showdown is going to be more explosive and more violent, but hopefully it occurs after enough time has passed that the ideas on the opposition side are more mature and have a better chance at winning.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Thanassis. Best of luck to you.
Great to talk to you.
Thanassis Cambanis is my guest. He is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City, and we've been talking about his book, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story. This is Uprising. 4 years ago, around the same time as the Egyptian Revolution took place, Yemen had its own Arab Spring moment, toppling longtime President Ali Abdullah Saleh. We turn next to Mumia Abu Jamal, a political prisoner and an award-winning journalist who filed this commentary on the latest situation in Yemen.
Yemen, resignations of state. With the resignations of Yemen's president, Abd Rabbo Mansour Hadi, the prime minister, and the presidential cabinet, Yemen shows the limits of U.S. support for its allies and the gathering strength of rebels opposed to the central government. The rebels, most from the Houthi clans, are primarily Shias and followers of a Yemeni cleric named Hussein al-Houthi, said to have been killed by Yemeni government forces in June 2004. They took control of the presidential residence and held Hadi captive for several days until he agreed to Houthi demands. Imprisoned, at home, isolated, Hadi and his associates chose resignations and ceded power. Yemen, located in the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, has a fabled ancient history. Remember the Queen of Sheba? Sheba was known to the ancient world as Saba, and Yemen was part of that ancient kingdom. Today, Yemen is one of the poorest countries on earth. Yemen is the ancestral home of the Bin Laden clan, which hails from the holy city of Tarim in the Hadramaut Valley. It is also a central focus of the so-called U.S. war on terror, where American drones and bombs deliver death daily to Yemenis regarded as radicals by Americans. According to the WikiLeaks revelations, former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh told former U.S. General David Petraeus regarding the bombings of Yemenis, "We'll continue saying the bombs are ours, not yours." Soon Yemen was engulfed in an Arab Spring that ended Saleh's career. The kiss of death, it seems, is to be an American ally, for it stirs deep hatreds among the population. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. And by the way, I'll be on the Tavis Smiley show late tonight on PBS. I'll be on a panel alongside Roseanne Barr and Hussam Ayloush of CARE discussing the issue of free speech. The U.S. Supreme Court has decided once more to take it upon itself to consider a landmark civil rights law, a case involving affordable housing vouchers, and the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs has put the 1968 Fair Housing Act in the court's crosshairs. Under the existing law, groups can sue individuals or institutions over racial segregation in housing, even if they cannot prove that the segregation was intentional. Conservatives have long argued that racial segregation should be legal as long as it's not deliberate. The court has in the past few years undermined several laws passed by Congress to address institutional racism during the civil rights movement. Justices eviscerated a key provision of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, and already many states have used that ruling to legally justify voter disenfranchisement. Consequently, it's likely that the Supreme Court is leaning toward ending the entire basis of the Fair Housing Act as well. If that happens, it would reverse 4 decades of case law. Housing discrimination historically formed the basis of racial segregation in the United States, and sharp disparities still exist along color lines. My guest is John A. Powell. He's a professor of law and of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion and the director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California, Berkeley. He's written many books. His latest one is Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Others to Build an Inclusive Society. Now, John, welcome to Uprising.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. You are on the board of the board of directors of the Inclusive Communities Project, which is the Texas nonprofit that is trying to racially integrate housing in Texas. And because the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs is issuing affordable housing vouchers mostly in black neighborhoods and not in white suburbs, the ICP is suing it over the Fair Housing Act. Does that sum it up?
That's right. That's very accurate.
So essentially, we have a case here where you have a state authority that doesn't want to be held accountable to have racial integration in housing because it's claiming that that's not intentional, that that's just the way it's turning out?
That's what it's claiming. It's really going after what's called disparate impact, which is basically saying that you can prove make a claim for racial discrimination without proof of intent. And as we know, since probably the 1970s, even where there's profound racial discrimination, sometimes it's hard to prove that someone intended it. There's a whole body of work and literature both on unconscious bias and also on structural bias, that structures actually can produce negative outcomes. And to suggest that that body of law, which has been in place since the 1960s under fair housing, is inappropriate, it's really saying, let's go back. Let's really return to the good old days where we allow discrimination, we allow segregation, we allow a society that's highly regulated by race as long as we can't prove intent.
Let's quote, let's take a look at the language of the Fair Housing Act. Under this 1968 law, it is, quote, illegal to refuse to sell or rent or to refuse to negotiate for the sale or rental of or otherwise make unavailable or deny a dwelling to any person because of race. So the Supreme Court wants to rule on whether this language can be used to sue based on disparate impact. Essentially, what they're saying is that if you can't prove that somebody intended a racist outcome, that it's fine. But that just, I mean, that's kind of crazy.
It is. It's not just somebody, it's the state. So if the state organizes schools, housing that are completely segregated, and then they can say, but we didn't intend for that to happen, that just happened, and we shouldn't be able to do anything about it. So the whole purpose of the Civil Rights Act was to really usher in a period where we would have an inclusive society. And whether it's intended or not, it's actually sort of irrelevant. It's actually, if you think about what the court's doing, which is quite interesting, it's turning back on civil rights and it's expanding at the same time corporate rights. And those two things go hand in hand. So it has this very expansive reading of all the statutes that protect corporations, including the idea that corporations are effectively people, which is certainly not in the Constitution, at the same time narrowing what we can do in terms of civil rights. If you can't prove it, it's not a harm.
I mean, I'm thinking of those incidents that are well documented during the 50s and 60s when African Americans attempted to register to vote, and they were simply told, you know, they were given these ridiculously difficult tests that they had to take, and if they failed those tests that they were set up to fail, they couldn't register to vote. And when asked why they weren't allowing African Americans to vote, the white registry staff would simply say, well, they just didn't pass the test. They never admitted that they were being racist. So we're relying on admission of racism to uphold the law?
That's right. And of course, in today's world, no one's going to say or admit or even sometimes believe that they're involved in racist acts. Now, think about the climate. How many people would say, I'm getting up today and I'm going to deliberately try to warm up the climate or cause climate change? That's, whether we're trying to make the climate change or hotter or chaotic, is almost irrelevant. The question is, are we? And if we are, we should act to do something about it. Similarly, if we're stratifying society in a racially segregated way, if we're denying people access to full participation as members of society, it's irrelevant whether we intended for that to happen. And it's not a new body of law. This law has been in place since the 1960s. And it's not just in housing, it's also in voting, as you suggested, it's also in employment. So the court is really on a very disturbing trend to really turn back the clock to the early 1950s.
Now, under existing law, under the Fair Housing Act of 1968 as it's written, can't institutions already show some kind of, if they do have a real justification and can prove it, that they are still allowed under existing law to, you know, do something that might have racist outcomes as long as they can prove that there's a good reason?
Yes. So basically, and this comes out of Title VII, which is fair employment, and Title VIII is fair housing. And the courts developed this structure, which is that if you have a disparate impact, and the party causing that disparate impact can state a legitimate reason, and no other reason that could achieve that same outcome, then the disparate impact is okay. So when you have a discriminatory impact, it doesn't automatically mean that the party suing to overturn that impact win. The defendant can say, this is the only way I can build housing, and there's a crisis to build housing, and there's no other way of doing this. And if they can show all that, then they win. And again, it's important to, this is both in employment and in housing and other areas. And this has been in place for over 40 years. And, you know, the sky hasn't fallen. And in fact, even with disparate impact, the country still remains highly racially and economically segregated. So in many ways, it doesn't go far enough.
So, John, the court has taken it upon itself to take up this law. This is a law that Congress enacted, that the president at the time signed, and it is, of course, up to Congress to create laws. There's 4 decades of case law that establishes this. This is the 3rd time in the last 3 years that the Supreme Court has attempted to take on a case involving the Fair Housing Act. The last 2 attempts, the case was taken care of or wrapped up before it could reach the Supreme Court. It seems as though the court is very eager to undo this act, that they are being very proactive on this issue, and it has surprised many. What is their real agenda?
Well, it's actually interesting because this law was changed in 1988. It was strengthened in 1988 by a Republican Congress. So this is not a liberal law. This law was passed and supported by both Democrats and Congress, and as you said, signed by the president. So the court is really has a very strong agenda to roll back civil rights. They adopted new rules, one saying you have to prove intent. Under that rule, when people of color have brought actions against whites to the Supreme Court claiming discrimination, they haven't won one time, not one time, in the last 30 years. Or do you believe there's really no discrimination against people of color in the last 30 years? So the court is actually at the spearhead. And the spearhead really has 2 dimensions to it, to actually roll back civil rights and to expand corporate rights. And it's, in a sense, further ahead than almost any other branch of government. And so now there is something that happened in the argument that suggests that some of the justices that we would expect to align with the right, particularly Justice Scalia, may be troubled by how far the court is going. But the court is really being activist. It has its own agenda. Judge Robert, when he became Chief Justice, said he didn't have an agenda. Clearly, this court has a very aggressive agenda, and I think it's out of step with where America wants to go.
And what lessons can we learn from the 2013 striking down of a key provision in the Voting Rights Act, one of the 3 main laws? If we look at the sort of legislative achievements of the civil rights movement, we have the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and of course some other lesser acts as well, that the court is now seemingly taking apart bit by bit. 2013, it was the Voting Rights Act provision for states. Have we seen since then states act to severely take advantage of this ruling by the Supreme Court?
Immediately. I mean, almost before the ink had dried, Texas and other states started passing voter suppression laws. And even conservative justices, even conservative members of the court basically said this is just a rule to actually engage in voter suppression. And we've never had this level of nationwide voter suppression in the country. You know, frankly, it's part of the Republican agenda. We have states after states, and they're all Republican, led by governors and legislators. It's their strategy to make sure that people of color, and particularly African Americans, others, can't vote, which really undermines not just our elections, but our whole claim for democracy. And again, the court is really leading this. And so, yes, the impact was immediate. The same in terms of cases like Citizens United, which basically brought more money into politics, which overturned 100 years of law. So this court is extremely activist, extremely aggressive, and extremely conservative. The good news is, if there's any good news, it's always 5-4. So out of 9 members of the court, it's sharply divided. And Justice Kennedy is usually the swing vote. So it's not that the court is deeply entrenched. And one of the things it suggests is that we need to look more carefully at the court and who's on the court. It matters a great deal.
Now, What is this sort of color blindness concept that conservatives on the court and the conservatives on the court are upholding? We hear this so much more and more that the justification for undoing legislative achievements of the Civil Rights Act is that we're living in a post-racial society, apparently, which of course most of us know we're not, and that these laws, we are told, actually impact people of color because it suggests that they are somehow unable to make it in a society where we don't have racist laws anymore, that we should be entering a new era of color blindness. How do you respond? How do you argue with someone who says that?
Well, first of all, there's a history to colorblindness, and it comes from Justice Harlan in a famous case, Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court actually instituted and supported segregated boxcars on railroads, and then that moved into schools, the whole idea of separate but equal. And Justice Harlan, who is liked by liberal and conservative justices, said that our Constitution is colorblind. But he went on to make it clear that he believed that you had to look at what a law is actually doing. In other words, the idea he wasn't a formalist. He believed that what a law does, not just what it says it's doing, matters. And then, of course, people picked up Dr. King's famous speech, at least part of it, and took it out of context so that people could say society is supposed to be colorblind. But colorblind as a goal and colorblind as a strategy are two different things. We might say that we want to get to a place where race doesn't matter. But in fact, we know it does. We're not there. How do we get there? And what really the conservative justices are saying is that the largest injury in terms of race and civil rights is not segregating people. It's not denying people's jobs. It's not denying people the right to vote. It's noticing their race. It's when the state notices race at all. That's the injury. It's not the act. So you can, and this goes in every area. So for example, there was a famous case where it was showed that if you're black and you kill a white person, you're more likely to get the death penalty than if you're black and you kill another black person. And the data was overwhelming. And again, the court said, well, you didn't prove intent. There's no showing of intent. So the fact that we're actually killing people, and we can show statistically, without dispute, that we're killing people based on race, the court is still saying that's not an injury. The injury is if you notice someone's race. That's the injury. Now, the reality is, especially knowing all the stuff we know about the mind science, we all notice race. And we're in a society which is hyper-racialized. So it's really a political strategy to ploy. It's a language to basically say we can't do anything to undo all the racial stratification that exists through every aspect of society.
And what you were saying on the issue of discrimination and executions, we all know that happens very much in arrest rates and police violence as well, including fatal police violence, an issue that has become a very, very important issue in the last year or so. Let's talk about something that is related to fair housing. The Fair Housing Act up at stake as the court has decided to take it up in this Texas case. There's the issue of segregation in education as well. There was a lengthy article in ProPublica recently called Segregation Now that details racial segregation in our public schools, and it examines in particular Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where, quote, 1 in 3 black students attends a school that looks like Brown versus Board of Education never happened, and people are just calling them apartheid schools. And when we not only do we already have a situation today where schools are seriously racially segregated, if the Fair Housing Act is eviscerated, couldn't that get worse? Because of course kids go to school where they live. If we have more segregated housing, our schools are going to be even more segregated, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And they're going to be segregated not just by race, but also by language and by income. And every educator, again, for the last 40 years have said schools that are deeply segregated by race and income are harder, not impossible, but harder for students to get a fair education. It's also, we're talking about moving to a multiracial society, multi-ethnic society, where the whole purpose of education in part is to prepare us to live as citizens in a diverse society. We can't do that by segregating students. So all the research literature says that's a breeding ground for hostility, for misunderstanding, for bias, for prejudice, and of course it violates the law. And yet, again, the court is saying, well, unless you can prove that someone intended for this to happen, and we know that housing and schools are very closely linked. And so we walk around the country. I live in San Francisco. The schools are highly segregated here. You go to New York, which is one of the most liberal cities in the country. It's also one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so people can walk around and say, you know, I have Black friends, Latino friends, Asian friends. Yet the reality is people are highly segregated. And when I say people in this group that's most segregated are upper middle class whites by living in the suburbs and opting out of public space. And what they've been able to do is get the court to protect their prerogative, not to be in school, in neighborhoods, in deep relationship with the rest of the country.
John, we have a very important year this year. It's the 50th anniversary of the march from Montgomery to from Selma to Montgomery, and of course the incredible film by Ava DuVernay that many Americans are going to see, called Selma, that brings our history to light. The Supreme Court decided to take up this case against the Fair Housing Act just 2 days after Martin Luther King Day last week, and I'm wondering first how important history is in our appreciation for civil rights laws, and second, whether people appreciate, whether people are aware enough, whether they go to private schools or public schools, of the fact that scores of Americans, black and white, struggled and died and risked their lives for these laws.
Well, I think we're not very much aware of our history. And in fact, it's not even our history. It's actually living out today. So when we think of 50 years, that may sound like a long time, but you can't really understand America today. You can't understand our economy. You can't understand the way our space is organized, our schools. You can't understand what's happening in terms of transportation, where we build roads, without looking at this history. This history was never dismantled. We never stopped doing this. All we really stopped doing is talking about it and being explicit. And so, for example, if we're going to change the way we do, for example, policing, we have to do that largely by petitioning the government. And how do we get a responsive, effective, inclusive government except through voting? And so it's not accidental that the states where you have low participation of blacks, or we have and when I talk about Republicans, I'm not talking about this in terms of party. If you look at statewide elections around the country, 98% of the people elected in state offices are white in the Republican Party. The Republican Party has become white people's party in the United States. And it's not just phenotype, it's that they aggressively pursue things that hurt every aspect of our lives. And we don't sort of realize that. This was a strategy that the Republicans adopted in the 1960s. How do you actually turn back the clock? How do you actually take advantage of white resentment to actually restructure the government and thereby restructure the economy in favor of the elites? So there's this powerful relationship also between the growing inequality in wealth, the polarization in government, neoliberalism, and race. All these things are powerfully interconnected, and most Americans don't understand it because we don't read history, and we don't and we think race is just about personal animus between two people.
Well, Dr. Powell, finally, where will the Supreme Court set its sights next? We've seen the voting rights law being gutted, a key provision of it that really formed the basis of it. If they succeed in undermining the Fair Housing Act, what next is up for grabs? Employment protection, any other laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, are those up for grabs now by the Supreme Court?
I think so. I mean, you mentioned the movie Selma, and there was one scene in Selma where they're talking about, should they pass this provision, should they pass that provision? And they stop and say, look, we're not just talking about a provision. We're not being tactical. We're being strategic. And so all these things hang together. In a sense, that's what the court is doing. So they're not just going after one law. They're going after actually trying to remake society. And so if you think about the Civil Rights era, hundreds of laws were passed at the state level, at the federal level, and thousands were passed at the state level. So all those things are actually up for grabs. There's a through line between all these things. And so we see the court just sort of marching through and in a sense trying to figure out, I think, what's the most effective way for it to actually roll back. So the court has wanted to look at a disparate impact case. It's been trying to look. Most of your listeners may not realize, at the Supreme Court, the court doesn't have to take cases. It selects which cases it wants. So you can petition the court, meaning asking them to take the case. And most time the court says, no, we don't want to hear it. And sometimes it's not, and when they take cases, there's normally a process, like is there a conflict between jurisdictions at the state level? And again, sometimes the court has gone beyond that. So there's an aggressive strategy game plan that the Roberts Court is actually pursuing. And it's one where civil rights, human rights are greatly constrained, environmental rights greatly constrained, and corporate rights greatly expanded. And it's not a pretty world.
Finally, do you think that Congress, if the Supreme Court does undermine the Fair Housing Act, that Congress could restore it? Technically, whether they would or not is another question, given that Republicans dominate both houses now. But could Congress theoretically go back and restore it and say, no, we actually do believe that you don't have to prove intent when there's disparate impact?
They certainly could, and there's a number of ways of doing it. Going back to the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment actually has several provisions. One of them is about citizenship, one's about due process, and one's about equality. And what the court is ruling is on the equal protection claims. But there's other provisions of the Constitution that we don't use as often. For example, the 13th Amendment deals with slavery and the badge as incidents of slavery. And there's some housing cases that suggest that segregated housing continues to be a badge and incidents of slavery. And there's nothing in the 14th Amendment, any provision that says you have to prove intent. That's a court-adopted doctrine. And it was adopted fairly recently. So the court keeps raising the standard. But so far, they haven't done the same thing with the 13th Amendment. So Congress could not only repass the Civil Rights Act and housing to not require intent, it also could pass it under a different provision than the 14th Amendment altogether, like the 13th Amendment.
Well, we shall see what happens. I want to thank you so much, John A. Powell, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
My guest, Dr. John Powell, is a professor of law and a professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies. He's also the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion and the director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California at Berkeley. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.